Hello and welcome to Games Past Prime, this show where I take a look at video games and determine if they are past their prime or not. For me to do so though, there are a couple key categories which I look at. Story, presentation, and gameplay. Then at the very end, I wrap everything up in a nice little bow. You guys read the title, you know what game we're playing. Let's take a look at Hybrid Heaven. You start out the game with a pretty lengthy cutscene that more or less explains the following. Mr. Diaz, a synthetic human hybrid created by the aliens, turns against his masters and kills another hybrid intended to replace the president's bodyguard, Johnny Slater. You take over as this character and find yourself in a large underground facility that appears to be created by aliens underneath Manhattan. As you progress through the story, it is revealed that you are actually playing as Johnny Slater, who was disguised as Diaz by the Gargantuans, who also wiped his memories. The Gargantuans turn him back into Johnny Slater and give back his memories, and they continue to explain that they are normally peaceful aliens, but they were betrayed by one of their own who decided he wanted to take over Earth and force the rest of his species to take part in his genetic experiments. The aliens were able to create clones and hybrids, a mix between human and gargantuan DNA that created a better, more powerful species, or so that's what they say. The new leader of the Gargantuans is slowly swapping out real people with clones that he controls, and plans on doing this with the President of the United States. A few Gargantuans were able to free themselves from this traitor and start a resistance. However, they needed help, which is why they decided to save Johnny when he was about to be killed and made him look like Diaz. They then asked Johnny to save the President and the pilot of the ship to be able to stop this conflict from continuing on. The main reason Johnny accepts to do so is because 1, if he doesn't, the world will be ruled by this traitor, and 2, because he wishes to see his girlfriend for Christmas? Regardless, Johnny goes about completing each task to save the world. Really, there isn't much else to say about the story. It's about as tropey and ridiculous as you'd expect a cheesy sci-fi movie made in the 80s or early 90s would feel like. Well, let's first take a look at the graphics. They aren't bad when you look at them, but one thing you may notice is that there's a lot of dark and bland colors. Also, many of the rooms and stages look very similar to one another. In fact, you will find whole levels that are literally the same thing. Right down to how you are supposed to complete the level. It's a bit crazy. I honestly got deja vu during these rooms because I could have sworn I had already completed these areas before, only to realize that they legit just copy and pasted entire sections. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I have seen some lazy layout for maps before, but this is a whole new level of lazy. Well, there's at least one thing that they made colorful, and that was some of the enemies. I like their designs and the color they put onto them to make them stand out more, and there is quite a large variety of them as well, which is nice. The downside is the game is rather long, and even with the large amount of enemies, towards the end you will start seeing quite a lot of repeats, which does start to bore rather quickly. Overall, the graphics are just alright. Nothing really bad, but not exactly that great either. It's just sort of there, and while they made great monsters, they hindered it by making the game long enough that you start to see a lot of repeating enemies and a lot of repeating rooms and areas. With that said, let's move on to the music, and well, it's also just kinda okay. Nothing really stands out as amazing, but it's not exactly bad either. When I was looking through the music, there were a lot of tracks, 43 if I remember correctly. However, a lot of them sounded very similar to each other, and I almost fell asleep trying to find just a couple to play for you that didn't sound too close to each other. Also, none of the music had names to identify the tracks that were playing, it was only identified with the numbers. So I'm just gonna randomly edit some footage in here, even if it doesn't match the music. If they are too lazy to name their tracks, then I'm not going to go out of my way to find where that track is supposed to fit. So, without further ado, here are the tracks that I thought were the most interesting to listen to. The gameplay of Hybrid Heaven is an interesting one. It's one that both makes and breaks the game for me. However, before I start to give my opinion on it, let's first talk about what this game is and a little bit more about the controls. Now, describing what genre this game falls into is actually a bit of a difficult one. It's got a bit of action and adventure mixed with some weird RPG mechanics. So, for example, when you are just running around in third person, there'll be drones of different kinds that you can shoot down with this sort of futuristic phaser gun. I forget what they even named it, to be honest. I think I named it later below, and I'm just too lazy to even go back and check. Sometimes you'll need to aim up high to shoot flying drones or down low to shoot mine drones. Then there'll be sections where either you run into guards or monsters, and then you'll engage them in hand-to-hand combat. I guess the phaser gun doesn't do anything to humanoid characters. It's not all that explained, at least I wasn't paying attention enough to care. This is where that RPG style comes into play, and it's pretty in-depth. I will try to explain it all as best as I can for you though. So there are many different kinds of attacks, but they are all categorized into 3 styles: punching, kicking, and technique. Punching and kicking is pretty self-explanatory, but technique is just moves that are more specialized, typically wrestling or grappling moves. Now then, each body part, left arm, right arm, head, body, left leg, and right leg all level up independently of each other, and this includes for both offense and defense. Equally, each move levels up independently of each other as well. The more times you use a move, it will level up and more likely to level up the limb that is using that ability, such as using a left head kick versus a right head kick or a left uppercut versus a right uppercut. On that note, technique moves will typically level up the main body, since a lot of wrestling moves and grappling moves need to have a strong core. Now, an interesting mechanic they added in is that if you continue to only level up one ability, it'll eventually cap out, forcing you to use other abilities, which will then increase the cap of all the abilities within that tree. Punching, kicking, technique, etc. Now, let's talk about the power meter. Power meter lets you know when you can attack, but if you just attack right away when the power meter lets you, you won't do the most damage. If you let it fill up, one attack will use a full power meter bar and will have a higher chance of doing max damage. As you continue to level up overall, you will unlock more power meters. This will then allow you to combo abilities together to do even more damage. If you pull off a full combo string, there's a chance of also doing a special finishing move that you normally don't have access to. Now then, combat is actually more like an action RPG because you can move around in an attempt to get out of the way of enemies' attacks, but this also means that you won't be close enough either. So there is sort of a give and take mechanic here where you want to get close only when you want to attack, but try to stay out of the way when you are trying to refill your power meters. However, the power meters take longer to fill up when you are moving, so there is this very intricate song and dance you need to play with the AI, and each monster or guard will react slightly differently from the rest. Now, before I continue on with the rest of the combat, I quickly want to talk about the controls. To move around, you just use the control stick, but the downside of this is you don't really have control of the camera during out of combat sections, and as you move through one area to the next, the camera angle can change and thus change out the controls of which way is forward or not. Kind of annoying. On that note, Johnny moves slower than molasses and takes forever to get up to speed. This becomes an issue that I will discuss later. Out of combat, Johnny can open treasure boxes or open doors by just approaching the object and pushing forward with the control stick. The A button lets Johnny jump and lets him grab on the ledges, or if you can get a running start, you can make Johnny do a leaping jump. When you press the Z button, Johnny will get down on the ground and start to crawl. When you push down the R button, it pulls out the diffuser, and you can shoot with the A button. During this, you can aim up or down by just pushing the control stick up or down. Equally, while holding down the R button, you cannot move, and on top of that, there are no bullets that actually come out of the diffuser, and there's a certain max range that it will only hit targets at. Now, when you get into hand-to-hand combat, you still move with the control stick. The A button lets you pull up the menu to decide to attack or use an item, and the control stick is used here to navigate the menus, and the A button again will select whatever the cursor is on. When the enemy attacks, it will pull up a menu for you to decide on a reaction. You can defend, attempt to step out of the way, or counter. This is only if you are being hit. If the enemy grabs you, you are given the options to escape, do a reversal, or just take a fall. Then, if you are on the ground and they try to attack you, you can try to roll out of the way or to counter. Honestly, doing anything other than defending, taking the fall, or rolling out of the way feels like a waste, because if you fail any of the other options, you will likely take more damage than normal, and I've never been able to do any of the other options. Maybe I'm just really unlucky. Now, some of the other things with combat, just like RPGs, you can use items such as ones that give you back health, increase your defense or offense, and other such battle items. Now that I've talked about loosely the controls and roughly how the combat works, Trust me, there's a lot more things there to talk about in depth, but I'm not an expert, and I'm definitely not the person to be talking about all of that in depth. I feel just explaining the core mechanics will hopefully help you to understand as I continue to talk more about what I like about the combat and what I didn't like. Now, first and foremost, this combat idea is much ahead of its time in my opinion, because not only do each body part level up separately of each other, but equally you can injure those body parts either on the enemy or they can do it back to you. For example, if you hit them enough times in, say, the legs, you now make them move slower. But say they wrestle you and drop you on your head and injure that, well, you're just going to be stuck there not moving anytime soon. The body parts will eventually go back to normal or heal itself over time, but I like this idea and I also hate it. See, the problem is that it feels like enemies don't always follow the same rules you do, especially the bosses. You'll run into enemies that can go invisible, or you'll run into bosses that will activate the ability to hit you, but then it'll allow them to take a step towards you first, and then do their attack. This is something you can't do, which just makes it more frustrating to deal with. The other problems I have with this game are pretty numerous, such as the guards. If you back too far away from them, they'll just shoot you with a gun, which they never run out of using, unlike you. Now, before I go on a rant about some of the things that really piss me off, I want to warn you first that I don't know how loud I will get. So, headphone users, be warned. Now, just like a lot of RPGs back in the day, you can't just save anywhere. You must first find a save station. Thankfully, these heal you all the way up, and most enemies don't respawn, except for the drones, which you can typically just run past anyways. However, there are many boss fights that don't take place in the hand-to-hand combat. The out-of-combat controls, combined with the camera, don't feel good. The first one I ran up against was on a bridge, and it was just basically a giant drone. After figuring out its pattern, it wasn't that bad, just kind of annoying. However, the next mini-boss is just before a major boss fight, and this mini-boss is absolutely the worst thing I have experienced in a while. First off, you are put into a pit with two large monsters. One rushes at you to hit you, while the other one shoots these fire pillars at you. Where the monster shoots is indicated by a target, one that follows you. This sounds handy, but it isn't. See, the strategy is you need to take out the one that's rushing at you first. To do this, you want to get him to run into the pillars of fire the other one is shooting at you. The idea is simple, but the execution is lacking. See, when the monster runs into the fire, it cuts to the monster and shows him being hurt. You'd think that this is a cutscene, but you'd be wrong. The rest of the game is still playing. So you are running around off screen, praying you don't get hit by the fire pillars. And trust me, you likely will. And it happened to me plenty of times. I don't know about you, but getting hit off screen because you can't see where you are is really annoying. But after a couple of hits, this monster will eventually go down. Now, the one that shoots fire at you will then start to rush you. To defeat this one, you need to get him to run into a specific door that falls down deep below. However, you need to get it to run into this door a couple of times. The problem is that getting the monster to hit the door is a bit annoying because you are also trying to avoid getting hit by it at the same time since it does a lot of damage to you. Now, the other issue here is that on the last hit of the door, if he happens to hit you into the door, you go falling down the pit and not the monster. This leads to you dying and having not to only go back to that mini-boss fight, but you gotta watch a cutscene first, which you can't skip every single time. And this guy drones on forever. Oh, and let me not forget that the camera still seems to screw up for no reason. Sometimes it will follow the monster and you are again off screen, not really knowing where you are, only to see the monster rushing at you and he's probably gonna hit you. Oh, and in case it wasn't obvious yet, this monster is very fast and seems to move on a dime. So avoiding him was very, very difficult. It took me about an hour just to beat this mini-boss before the actual boss. Oh, and guess what? Think there'll be a save point after this? No! Screw you! You now need to fight the boss right after it, and he is the absolute worst. He uses items that make him stronger and faster, he uses high-grade guns that can freeze you in place, and he does massive damage. Oh, and let's not forget, he uses a healing item that heals him to full, so the couple times I got close to actually beating him, he just used that. So not only did he obviously beat me, now I need to fight that mini-boss again! So I do. It takes me about another hour to beat the mini-boss again, and spend another half hour fighting the boss, only to lose again. At this point, I threw the towel in. I had spent 8 hours playing through this game at this point, and spent around another 3 just to get past this boss, which I never actually did. I had nearly 12 hours into this game, only to find after looking at a walkthrough that I was only around 75% done, and that I still had many hours left, and a more annoying last boss to fight. This is where I stopped playing. That's right, I didn't finish this game. I refused to finish it. You might say this review is incomplete, but honestly, I got to experience everything the game had to offer. There are sections I do like. I like the idea of the combat, it's very interesting to me. However, it feels like they tried to do too much. They tried to make an RPG with action-adventure elements that just don't click together well. On top of that, the game is very long, and the worst part is it feels very long. I played plenty of RPGs that are very long. The difference is that you either are invested in the story, or the characters, or even how the combat evolves enough to not really care about the length or about the grinding. I can't say this game has done that for me. Honestly, if they would have gotten rid of the awkward action segments and focused only on the combat, I think it would have been a better game, but who knows now, it's too late. Listen, the game isn't bad, but you can tell they tried something new, and it feels like they either spread themselves too thin or simply ran out of time. But, with that said, let's move on to the verdict. The verdict of Hyrbid Heaven is a game past its prime. This is a very interesting game. It's going to be one of those very few times that I'm actually going to label it past its prime, but still recommend people to try it for its very different combat mechanics. Listen, I don't think it's worth beating at all, or even playing nearly as much as I did, but it's definitely worth trying. That RPG mechanic, that sort of limb action combat, is just really interesting and really well done, and that's clearly the most fleshed out part of this entire game. Now, I'm going to go over the top 5 reasons I believe it's past its prime. Number 1. The story is pretty generic for a sci-fi story. There really isn't much to talk about here other than that. If I'm going to be honest, I normally try to talk about more in these points, but what else is there really to say about a bland story? Number 2. The overall presentation isn't bad, it's just another thing that's bland. Very little color is used, they recycle whole floor designs, and the music all sounds the dang same. Number 3. The out of combat sections, the more action-adventure segments, are alright, if not just a bit boring. The drones are everywhere, and not being able to move while trying to shoot several enemies at once is just tiring. It got down to the point that I would just run through those segments instead because there wasn't much of a point to destroying them except once in a while getting an item drop. Then when we talk about the mini-boss fights, they use these mechanics and it's just so bad. The camera just doesn't work at all and it can just constantly screw you over. Number 4. The hand-to-hand combat is fun at first. Then it starts to get a bit repetitive, and then eventually start going up against enemies or bosses that feel like they cheat or don't play by the rules that you have been playing by. This makes it pretty annoying to play through because you never know exactly what to expect, and while you could argue this is good to progress the difficulty, I personally disagree. When the game decides to not play by the same rulebook, which it had been doing up until this point just to make the game more difficult, it becomes more frustrating, not more fun. If this difficulty curve may have been implemented over the course of the game, maybe it wouldn't have been noticed as much, but it has this crazy spike, and I honestly decided that it wasn't worth my time anymore. Number 5. The game feels long. Too long. By the time I got about 5 hours in, which was close to halfway, I was already checked out. The story wasn't interesting, the characters were mostly boring except for a few funny ones here and there, and the combat had become a bit stale. I felt I had unlocked a lot of the abilities, though I could be wrong, and if the game would have just been a bit shorter and it would have been only around 6 to 8 hours, I think I could have pushed through it. I still don't think it would have been worth finishing it because honestly at the end of the day, this feels like a game that became too ambitious and had just a bunch of ideas glued together, some of them even half-baked. I stopped having fun, and when you're playing games, that is one of the most critical aspects of a game, to take away from reality and to have fun. Now, obviously this is only my opinion. Everyone's definition of fun is not all the same, but for me this simply wasn't it. However, this doesn't mean there aren't people out there who will like it. I just think it's a flawed game that only a small select amount of people will actually get real enjoyment out of. Alright guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did enjoy watching it, please consider subscribing. I upload videos every Sunday. Stay tuned at the very end of the video to get an audio hint at what my next video will be. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and thanks for watching.